Imagine standing in a world where ships never learned how to float, where the oceans remained mysteries, and where one missing discovery changed the entire path of human progress. Before the great empires, before global trade, before the science classrooms of today, there was one man in ancient Greece who unlocked a secret so fundamental that it shaped every boat, submarine, and water-based technology that followed. His name was Archimedes, and for over 2,000 years, the principle he uncovered has guided the very way humanity understands the physical world. But now imagine something different. Imagine the moment in his workshop where he was supposed to notice water rising around him. The moment that would lead him to the discovery of buoyancy. What if that moment never happened? What if Archimedes never discovered the principle that makes things float? To understand how massive this change would be, picture life in the ancient world. Civilizations depended on rivers and seas. Ships carried grain, metals, soldiers, stories, and ideas. But the construction of those ships relied on practical experience, trial and error, a fragile mix of luck and tradition. Without a clear scientific understanding of why things float or sink, ancient engineers were always one mistake away from disaster. Archimedes' principle didn't just explain floating. It gave humanity a reliable method to predict it, measure it, and develop more advanced designs. Without that breakthrough, shipbuilding would remain a gamble for centuries. In this alternate timeline, imagine that gamble becoming a barrier. The Greeks, the Phoenicians, and even the powerful Romans would be limited by fear of the sea. Long-distance travel would slow down dramatically. Exploration across the Mediterranean would be hesitant and fragmented. Naval power, which shaped the rise and fall of empires, would never develop into a sophisticated science. In fact, without buoyancy as a known principle, the very idea of creating larger vessels would be viewed as reckless. Cargo ships would stay small, militaries would lose confidence in water-based expansion, and entire civilizations would be forced to grow inward rather than outward. Now imagine the ripple effect of that missing discovery on the scientific world itself. Archimedes didn't just change engineering, he changed how thinkers approached the natural world. His principle became one of the first true demonstrations of a scientific law in action. It taught people that nature could be measured, understood, predicted. Without this example, the timeline of scientific progress slows down. The idea that the physical world follows rules might take centuries longer to establish. A world without buoyancy, discovery is a world where early science is weaker, slower, and less ambitious. In this alternate history, the age of discovery, the era when Europe sent ships across the world, might never happen on time. With unreliable shipbuilding and constant fear of sinking, sailors would stay closer to shore. Nations like Spain, Portugal, and England might hesitate to explore beyond the horizon. America might remain unknown to Europe for decades longer. Trade routes would stay local, cultures would stay isolated, and global exchange would be delayed by generations. And with fewer voyages, the exchange of ideas, inventions, and technologies that fueled the Renaissance would shrink dramatically. But the impact goes even deeper. Buoyancy is not just for ships. It's the principle behind submarines, water pumps, hydrometers, hot air balloons, even modern fluid mechanics. Without Archimedes laying the foundation, future scientists like Pascal, Newton, and Bernoulli would have less to build upon. Entire fields of engineering might shift centuries into the future. Imagine a modern United States where naval power developed 100 years late, where the Panama Canal was impossible to design accurately, where submarine warfare never existed in World War II because the underlying science was not yet discovered. Even NASA, which relies heavily on fluid dynamics, might find itself slowed by generations. If you're re-enjoying exploring how one missing moment in ancient Greece could reshape not just the ancient world but the modern one you live in, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss part 2 of this timeline. This story goes far deeper than ships and science. It reaches into culture, warfare, global power, and the very identity of nations shaped by the sea. Imagine the United States growing into a nation where the oceans never became highways of opportunity but barriers of uncertainty. In our real timeline, ships carried settlers, ideas, resources, and entire cultures across the Atlantic. But in a world where buoyancy was never discovered, shipbuilding would remain primitive, dangerous, and deeply limited. The early colonies might receive fewer supplies, fewer immigrants, and far slower development. The rise of American coastal cities like New York, Boston, and Charleston would stall for decades. With no reliable science behind floating vessels, the cost and risk of ocean travel would increase so dramatically that crossing the Atlantic would turn into a rare fleet-level gamble rather than the foundation of a new nation's growth. This alternate America would develop inward, not outward. Settlements would be smaller, scattered, and constantly struggling with shortages. Trade with Europe would be minimal, turning cultural exchange into a trickle instead of a flood. And because naval technology would lag centuries behind, the young nation would grow without the maritime strength that shaped its identity. The idea of a powerful American Navy, something that later influenced world wars, global trade, and international diplomacy might never fully materialize, but the effects would stretch far beyond America. Around the world, societies would be forced to evolve in ways that depended less on oceans and more on land. Empires like Britain, built on naval dominance, would lose their greatest advantage. Instead of ruling seas, they would retreat into regional influence. The world map would shift. Nations with strong land routes and internal resources would rise instead. Central Asian powers, for example, might dominate trade because the Silk Road would become far more important without dependable sea routes. African kingdoms deep within the continent could flourish, because coastal powers would lack the ships to reach and exploit them. South America might remain untouched by European influence for far longer, reshaping its entire cultural and political future. As global exploration slows, so does global conflict. Maritime wars, from ancient naval battles to world-changing events like the Spanish Armada or the wars in the Pacific, would either shrink in scale or disappear entirely. Human warfare would evolve differently. Battles for sea dominance would be replaced by land-based conflicts, forcing nations to invest more in armies than navies. This shift dramatically alters technological innovation. Fewer advancements in navigation, ship design, and fluid dynamics means slower progress in physics and engineering. The kind of scientific curiosity that once grew from studying water, buoyancy, and pressure might never awaken fully. Now picture the modern world with this scientific delay. The engines that power ships today rely on principles of displacement and stability, rooted in buoyancy. Submarines, essential for research, defense, and exploration, would be impossible to construct. Offshore drilling for oil, deep-sea research, and underwater cables for global communication might develop centuries late, or not at all. A world that never mastered floating is a world that never mastered sinking in a controlled, scientific way either. Humanity would remain locked out of the ocean's depths. No deep-sea discoveries, no underwater archaeology, no global internet built on ocean floor infrastructure. Even climate science, which relies heavily on studying ocean behavior, would suffer major setbacks. Without Archimedes' work as a foundation, education itself changes. Children would grow up learning a version of physics that is patchy and incomplete. Everyday observations like why objects float in a bathtub or why cargo ships stay above water would remain mysteries, explained only through vague traditions or cultural myths. Scientific confidence would weaken. The belief that nature follows consistent, universal laws might take much longer to take hold, and with that hesitation, the spirit of innovation might dim across generations. But perhaps the greatest difference would be psychological. Humanity has always looked at the sea as a place of possibility. The ability to float gave people courage to leave home, explore, trade, and dream beyond the horizon. Take this away, and the world becomes mentally smaller. People grow cautious, nations grow isolated, and the natural curiosity that drives progress becomes harder to spark. The ocean, instead of connecting civilizations, becomes a wall that divides them. Yet despite all this, the human drive to understand the world would still exist. Someone, centuries after Archimedes, might eventually stumble upon buoyancy. But by then, the world would be so different that the discovery would not transform ancient empires, it would disrupt a modern age that had learned to live without the sea. Imagine that moment in an alternate future when a forgotten principle finally resurfaces and reshapes everything overnight. Global travel accelerates, science catches up in a rush, and nations race to reclaim the oceans they once feared. The world would shift more in a decade than it had in 1,000 years. If you want more alternate history stories like this one, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the worlds we explore next.